everyone, and welcome to the World Discord podcast. I think I'm still Brian Endless. Joel, are you there?
I don't know, judging by your social media post this morning. I'm not entirely sure you are still Brian Endless, but I am Joel Ostrow.
Joel doesn't always like me on social
No.
media. He has problems.
The feeling's mutual, I think, between us.
Anyway, we're looking forward to a great show today because our guest is someone who usually interviews us, and now we get to turn the tables. I'll let Joel introduce her in just a minute or so. Today, we're going to talk about how complicated our political environment is and all of the distractions in that environment. It seems like one thing happens and then 10 minutes or a day later, we're on to a completely new topic and we lose the old topic. And one of the questions that is important is, how does the media cover this? What's the right way for the media to cover this? Is there something that they should be doing that they're not doing? In some ways, how is the media culpable for the environment that we're in? So, Joel, I'll leave it there and ask you to introduce Joan.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. And you're absolutely right. Much more even than the content of this episode. I'm just looking forward to putting Joan on the spot after having been asked questions by her so many times that, as Joan herself will admit, sometimes come out of left field, sometimes come from, across the street.
No, never. No. There's always a method to the madness.
And usually a side text to alert me during the interview. Joan Esposito has a show, live, local, and progressive on WCPT AM 820, Chicago Progressive Talk. And prior to that, longtime Chicago television journalist, television reporter, and then news anchor on, I think, 2 or all 3 of the major local networks.
9, 7, and 5 never made it to 2.
Never 2. Okay.
This is in the days, not too many years ago when we only had 4 stations in Chicago.
And when Joan first had me on the radio, I don't know if you remember this, but you had said, nice to meet you. And I reminded you that we had met on air, I think on a Saturday morning, probably on Channel 5, at one of the various occasions when Yeltsin was in the hospital. And we were talking about that. But there was a long time in between that and Putin's invasion of Ukraine. But today, like Brian said, we want to talk about the difficulty that the news media have in covering really what strikes as an overload and an intentional overload of the news space, of the information environment, which is a typical strategy of wannabe dictators, along with misinformation and disinformation. My first real job was in journalism. And one of the reasons I decided that profession wasn't for me was because you got to cover really interesting stories, but you covered them, wrote about them, and left them and went on to the next thing. Maybe to kick it off, you can describe for us how this situation is different from for covering the news. Like, how is the environment and I know you're not doing reporting now as like a news reporter, but
I'm a news consumer. I consume a lot of news.
Yeah,
exactly.
But having reported on it, and you're still tight with a lot of journalists, like, how do they describe and how would you describe the different challenges for that job?
Well, more so than in years past, I think there's a real difference in what you get with the smaller independent media, local news, and mainstream media. Local news, for the most part, is doing a really good job for their communities. And local news has not deviated from the here are the facts. The mainstream media, I used to subscribe to the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I do not subscribe to any of them anymore
Wow.
because the New York Times infuriated me because they had a headline writing department that seemed straight out of Trump's campaign. And you'd read the article and you'd read the headline and you're like, that's not what this is about. So I got really frustrated with them. And then, everybody says, oh, you should stick with the Washington Post. There are still journalists trying to do a good job. But I'm worried. Bezos has clearly messed with the editorial department.
Oh, yeah.
Lots of people are leaving. And what's to say, even if Bezos hasn't sent the news department a memo, the managers in that news department, they know what their boss wants. They
And they want to
know
keep their jobs.
they
Yeah.
know that their boss doesn't want his other corporate interests to be damaged by what the Washington Post reports. So I don't trust them anymore, because
Yeah.
even in just deciding what to cover and what not to cover, you can manage or massage your coverage. And in the LA Times, Patrick Soon is a Jeff Bezos. Oh no, we don't want to make Donald Trump mad. So don't do this and don't say that. And no, that's not what I came for. Now I go to Washington Monthly, Rolling Stone, Mother Jones. There are a lot of The Atlantic. There are a lot of magazines that are picking up the slack and doing a damn fine job of it as well. Plus, a lot
Can
of
I ask?
Sure.
I want to follow up. I want to get more like. I think I appreciate all of that. I'm interested in the nitty gritty of the job, and I know that you notice when you have me on and we're talking about the domestic political situation and there's some topic. Most of my responses will talk about the direct consequence of the topic for a little bit, but I always try to step back and connect it to the macro level.
Oh,
This
Joel,
is authoritarianism.
context. You want context?
No, to
Oh,
me
there
it's
will be no
not.
context.
But to me, the context is actually the issue now, and that's different from the normal democracy situation where the topic is the topic. But now the topic, like zip tying citizens, isn't really the topic. The topic is the effort to destroy our democracy and create a more authoritarian or even fascist
Yes. And
political
that is where I
system.
think we've seen the mainstream media fail, because they
But
haven't
don't they
taken,
have to cover the topic? That's my
they
question.
don't
Yeah.
see,
Yeah.
people I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to from the profession. And it's like the New York Times should be reporting on the attempt to dismantle democracy, not
Yeah.
Trump made a speech, he said this,
Right.
Chuck Schumer said this, now we're done.
Yep.
That is such a disservice to everyone who is trying to, you in these times, these aren't normal times. You can't do
Right.
journalism the way you did it 20 years ago. We
Right.
have never been this close to an all-out dictatorship. And you
Right.
read the New York Times, you don't get that sense at all. And the only paper I still subscribe to is the Wall Street Journal. And sometimes I so enjoy their Trump will do something awful and they will do their darndest to try to find a positive spin. Trump taking a strong stand on the economy decides to, but you understand where they're coming from. The mainstream media is doing a terrible job at what you just said you want, Joel. The bigger picture, context. It ain't
But
there.
they have to cover the stories, don't they? Go ahead.
Well,
They
no,
cover the
what
stories.
stories
Sure,
they
this
cover.
person went here, this person said this, this other person went here, and this person
Yeah.
said this. There you go. You got the news, don't you?
You all have just brought up at least 10 things I want to talk about. So let's try to
You
sort
get
them
the
out.
next 10 questions. I'll sit down.
Exactly. So that'll be fun. First, Joan, you're reminding me of something Jon Stewart said when he was still doing the Daily Show, and it was, I think, Obama's first convention. He was interviewed about, you're not news, you're comedy. How do you get it right? And part of his answer was, well, you guys sit there and do exactly what you just said. You ask one side, you ask the other side, and then you tell the audience, well, thank you very much. That's it. We'll go to the next topic, as opposed to getting into any depth. I think that's one of the flaws we have. We also have a couple of other things. Joan, you started with the bias and the question of corporate media and the bias that comes with corporate media. Even if these are good reporters, they have limits on what they can do. I also think complexity plays into this, and the way the politicians deal with the complexity. If I remember right, this started with Bush 1 and the first Iraq War, and it became a question of what can news actually cover. So you go back to Watergate, and they dug in depth, and they had in-depth reporting and things. And at some point in time, what national news started covering was whatever the White House was talking about,
Yeah.
and maybe what the Senate talked about. But they seemed to be afraid that if they didn't cover that and someone else did, they'd miss a scoop or they'd miss something important. And whether it was reporting getting lazy or bosses getting cheaper and not allowing to do in-depth journalism, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that and how that changed even over the past 40 years. I don't think it's that recent. I think it's been changing for a while.
The observation most of us outside Washington have made for a long time is that they want to ask questions, but not anything that really upsets anybody, because they don't want to lose access. In a rare moment of honesty, back when Chuck Todd was doing one of the Sunday shows, somebody once asked him, because he'd had some person who came on and just lied, and sort of like, why weren't you tougher and why didn't you follow up? And he said, quite frankly, I don't want to anger this person, I don't want to anger their party, or I won't have access to the people I want to have access to.
But what good's the access if you don't ask the questions? Like,
And
that's the other
also,
side
I
of it,
also
right?
think he was wrong, because at the time he was hosting one of the big Sunday talk shows.
Oh, yeah.
And he's
right.
worried that if he makes somebody angry, they're not going to want to come on. Give me a break.
Right.
You know what you do then? Fine. You go and maybe you look at the other party. Maybe for the next 5 Sundays, you platform Democrats. You think the Republicans aren't going to turn around and show up on
Oh,
your
yeah.
show? That
Absolutely.
to me was such an absurd argument.
Yeah.
The networks, the mainstream media, they have so much power, and yet they're so afraid. Oh, they're so afraid. What if they won't talk to us? Oh, what are we going to do?
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
So why isn't that changing more now that Trump has kicked everybody out of the White House? They've changed so many of the reporters, and very few people have access now, and they're mostly vetted organizations. I'm wondering why we don't have some places like the New York Times and MSNBC and CNN going after him more, because they're still really not hitting him in depth.
I'm starting to see glimmers of that. Because I think they've realized that they literally have nothing to lose, that they're going to be treated badly by this White House, whether they try to suck up or don't suck up. And when Trump gave that press conference yesterday from the Netherlands, Caitlin Collins asked him a tough question. Now, he didn't let her follow up, but he at least took it. And then did you see when Kelly O'Donnell from NBC stood up? He was like, he called on her, and then he goes, okay, here we go. Here's another one. Here's another one. And she wasn't rude. She was deferential, but she asked some tough questions. And, I think they're finally waking up to a small degree, and it's coming. I guess I'm glad it's coming. It seems to be, to me, so late in the game. But this is not a president that you can be friendly with. This is going to be an adversarial relationship. And if you want to do any kind of reporting that is useful at all to people, you have to take a somewhat adversarial stance. No, that's not true. No, that's not true. Actually, this is what's true. you
As a
said
plan,
this before. Now you're saying this. What changed? Well,
yeah, but again, I'm going to go back to Jon Stewart, frankly, just because I loved his comedy reporting. But his staff was the most feared staff on TV because they had a clip for everything to do exactly what you're talking about. They
yeah.
always had the clip to show what you said before. That was
Isn't it
different.
funny that the Sunday shows don't seem to be able to do that, even
It's as
though they know what they're going to ask, they know what the topics are likely
And
to
they have a
be,
week to prepare it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and suddenly, you've got a Rick Scott saying something untrue, and they're like, well, that's not true. And sure it is. Yes, it is. Well, you could have had the clip right then and there.
yeah.
Um,
Well,
I don't
but
know
that
what's
begs
going
the
on.
question, like, so I don't know if you saw Hegseth gave his disinformation conference. Was it yesterday morning? And then uh, and he was attacking all of the networks and all of
Mhm.
the mainstream newspapers. Um, and Anderson Cooper on his show did a piece by piece. Hegseth said, "We said this, and they didn't report it." And then Cooper has a clip of him reporting it. The intelligence said this and they didn't report it. And then a clip of Anderson Cooper quoting that intelligence. And it was about a 5 minute takedown of every single thing Hegseth said they didn't do, showing that he actually did it and even did more than what Hegseth was complaining about wasn't happening. And he goes through this, but then he ends it there. And then goes on with his guests. And I know, I mean, I wasn't trained as a journalist, but when I took that job as a Moscow correspondent, I had to learn fast on how to write those stories in communication with my editor who was in London. And I had to learn fast in order to keep, and I had some training prior to that. I got the job because I'd been working for someone at the LA Times, and I kind of learned, like, you write the story and that's the story, right? So do you think that training counteracts their even ability to make those connections, or do they see the connections but don't see an opportunity, or do they think it's out of place to make those broader connections? Like,
I
what is
think
going on with that?
I'm glad Anderson Cooper did that. I think CNN is struggling right now with who they're going to be.
Yeah.
They've had like three different
Hmm.
leadership changes, like in the last couple years, and every
Hmm.
leader has a different vision. CNN, as you guys remember, when it started, it was like, we're just going to bring you the straight news from
Yeah.
around the world. Oh my
And
God,
that was
there's been
it.
an earthquake in Turkey. We're on the
Mhm.
ground there. There's this, there's that.
Mhm.
And that,
Right.
frankly, I think is what CNN does best. And
Yup.
then CNN, it kind of drifted away from that. And I think it couldn't decide if it wanted to be MSNBC or what.
Yeah.
And I think the reason, I'm guessing here, that Anderson didn't follow up that piece of tape the way you would have wished is, what does he say that doesn't sound like an op-ed at the end of that? CNN right now is really having a crisis of what it is
Right.
and what it is not. For instance, for the Trump inauguration, which CNN, of course, covered wall to wall, Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper were called into the boss's office. And the
Yeah.
boss said, let's not, I don't want to hear about how he's a convicted felon. The first time in our history, we put a convicted felon in the White House, and they weren't supposed to mention it. And very sadly, they both agreed to those terms.
Hmm.
That's not
Yeah.
news. That's a
Yeah.
corporate overlord who's afraid of what the larger ramifications are going to
Yeah.
be. That to me is emblematic of the problems at CNN.
You're making me think of the personal side of news and of big politicians and of how the news is dealing with it. And they're usually burying it, and sometimes it's incredibly important stuff, like the question of the felony, like the question of Pete Hegseth's past, and in particular, drinking on the job and things like that. One that has always struck me, though, is how they deal with both language and also mental ability. So
Mm.
language examples: George W. Bush, and I'll use a Democrat too, Richie Daley in Chicago on the other side. They both had difficult connections with the English language. If you ever listen
Sometimes
to
combative relationship.
if you ever listen to their full speeches, they weren't really speaking English. There was some other language going on there. Trump has that quite often if you listen to him for long enough when you're doing it. And then we had the question of, what was Biden's cognitive abilities? I know a number of people work closely with him who said he was great. And now there's some stories coming out that maybe he wasn't. But there's also a lot about Trump's cognitive abilities. Those are almost never covered, at least
Right.
in the mainstream print or
They
me
covered
or
the Biden, but they don't cover the Trump. Like
right. But
when
even
he
the,
when
even the
he
Biden, I don't think anybody went in depth. They covered Trump's
Mm,
accusations against Biden.
yeah.
Nobody did any kind of in-depth expose that I saw to say, hey, does Biden actually have these issues? I think that
That's
would
a
have
good
been
point. There's a
relatively clear.
difference there, isn't there? Yeah.
Yeah. But do you
Yeah.
have any thoughts on that? Why we're still there? Is that just a similar thing that they can't go there, or they feel they can't go there?
Well, um, a lot of times the news media, they want to bring you something of substance. So if the person you're interviewing says a bunch of word salad and then they say one or two things that are on point, the the compunction is to take the one or two sentences that are on point and get
Yeah.
those in your story and make that about the story. That's because you want your story to be meaningful,
Right.
and unless the story is, hey, this person gives us word salad at every turn, then you would share that. Because I think there's a sort of it's not, I don't think, a conscious bias. It's just the desire to find that which is actual information and use that. But if it happens once in a while, fine. And Richie Daley, a lot of times people just let him be, and
Yeah.
put it out there. And like, it was like,
Yeah.
that's Richie,
It was kind of that
that's,
way with W as well, wasn't it?
yeah.
Well, W, though,
But
they literally edited his speeches. When
Yeah.
they put him on in the press, they literally edited what he
yeah,
said.
Yeah.
there's somebody who speaks like Richie Daley, and then there's somebody who may be experiencing cognitive decline, and
And
those
that's
should
different.
be viewed as two very separate things. One
Right.
is worth reporting, one isn't.
Yeah.
No,
To what
absolutely.
extent, like I remember as you were talking, I was remembering back to Trump's first term, and there was all of this hand wringing about, the media being careful in its criticism to like avoid the accusation of liberal bias and all of that. Do you think that is still sort of front and center in a lot of the reporting,
I
or
think a lot of people will tell you the media has a liberal bias.
mm,
But if you really pay attention to the Washington
hmm
Post and the New York Times and the LA Times,
yeah,
I would argue that these days there is a conservative bias in almost
yep,
everything except
Absolutely.
MSNBC. Obviously
Yeah.
their whole business model is a liberal point of view, but
Right.
most of the mainstream media now has a
yep,
conservative bias,
Yeah.
not a liberal
right.
bias.
A Democrat wears a brown suit and they go absolutely berserk, but a Republican rapes multiple people and they shrug.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, when I talk about this in classes, there are a couple great charts out there. If you just look up media bias and New York Times, Washington Post, they're dead center to a little bit right, even on the ones where I
Hmm
agree with you. I think
Hmm.
they're probably a little bit
But
further than
Brian, I want to go back to something you said about reporting on struggles. One person whose struggles have been front and center is John Fetterman. I've
yeah,
seen
Mm,
three major publications. New York Magazine did the first big blowout story where they talked to current and former staffers, and
Hmm.
The fact that, everybody knows he had a stroke and then he hospitalized himself for depression. And by all accounts, he was put on a regimen of medicine and meditation and other stuff. And he was supposedly great when he came out of the hospital. But his staff is very worried because they say he hasn't followed the regimen and he's behaving erratically. New York Magazine did it, and two other major publications have picked up that story, and they acknowledge the New York Magazine reporting, and then they build on it. And so that's one instance where someone's mental health struggles that may be affecting their job performance are being reported in the media. I think Fetterman has missed more votes than anybody who's ever been in the Senate. He's missed something like 18.5% of all the votes that
Doesn't
have
even
been
go to
taken.
hearings.
Yeah, he says all that stuff's a waste of time. It's just a waste of time. He'd rather do something with his daughter.
Yeah.
Which is fine.
Let me ask your opinion on Fetterman in this particular case. Has he committed the sin of showing weakness? And are they going after him literally because of that? Which unfortunately would say that Trump might be right in always showing strength and never showing weakness. Is that a real thing, or is there something else going on there?
I don't think it's a question of strength versus weakness. I think from what I've read, and like I say, 3 different publications, his behavior is very erratic. And while the New York Magazine didn't come out and say this, if you read between the lines, I think that they were implying that he might even be capable of self-harm.
Yeah.
That's sad.
Yeah, it is very, very sad. I mean, there was a time when I thought he was the next big thing in the Democratic Party, and a person who could stand for liberal values and yet not lose his touch with the common man. I think we lost a lot when he had that stroke.
Yeah. The one area that seems to maybe offer, like, if there were media representatives here, I would imagine they would point, say, in the case of the New York Times or the LA Times, to their editorial pages, which are often very strong and do provide the broader warnings about threats to democracy and such.
Except when the owner steps in.
Huh?
Except when the owner steps in.
At the Post.
Yeah.
And
not
the
so
LA
much
Times,
Times.
the LA Times as well. Patrick Sutton has put down restrictions
That's
on
true.
what editorials can and cannot be.
Yeah, I guess you're right.
And he has shown some pro-Trump tendencies, and he'll say pro-Trump things. And
but I've even seen, even on some of those Sunday shows like Meet the Press, sometimes the little editorial wrap-up pieces do provide that sort of broader warning or context. Do you think that, is their position sort of that's enough, and then the rest of it is just straight reporting, and that's how they're doing their job? Or
Joel, I wish to God I was in those editorial meetings.
Yeah, what would you do?
What do they say? How are they coming to the decisions that they're coming to? Because it's a head scratcher.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Let's turn it a little bit here, and I'd like to talk about distractions and how you view them. And what I mean by that, yes, shiny object, Joel, every single time.
Yes.
Yeah.
What I mean by that, as opposed to what Joel means by that, is when we look at the news, and Trump does this, Netanyahu does this, but pretty much every leader does it to some extent. When the news turns bad, you put something up as a distraction. So we could, and personally I do, view the bombing of Iran as an extremely convenient distraction for both Netanyahu and for Trump in terms of the timing and changing the news. Does that mean that it was right or wrong? No, but it does mean it was absolutely distracting from other things going on. And arguably what we've seen with Trump, and Project 2025 flat out talks about this, and you need to do this. The question becomes, how much can you pile on one thing after another so that the press and opponents don't have any time to focus
Right.
and can't bring anything into a full perspective. They have to bounce to the next thing. It seems like it's a catch-22, and they've set up a situation that's almost impossible. Do you have any thoughts on how we should be dealing with this? I'd say
Yeah.
we're dealing with it poorly, but I
Yeah,
don't
I think
necessarily know how
so
to do
too.
about it.
Brian, I think you've just described Donald Trump's superpower.
Yeah.
He has no intellectual depth. He has no moral compass, but he has a feel for public relations. He
Yeah.
has a feel for what sells on television. And the media, he knows something's going on. Oh, you don't like what's in my murder bill? Okay. How about Marines in Los Angeles? How about this? He's brilliant at it, and I understand the quandary. He puts a news organization. I mean, do you ignore the distraction? I mean, the
Right.
distraction is usually something that is outrageous,
It's huge.
and
Yeah.
my argument would be, yeah, you have to cover the distraction, but don't lose sight of what's important. I frankly was shocked. Remember Signalgate, when
Yeah.
the Atlantic journalist Jeffrey Goldberg was included on what
Yeah.
should have been a super secure um, text chain talking about a military action in Yemen. I think that what we're seeing is an administration that knows that the media will follow the shiny object.
Yeah.
And the media is afraid to not follow the shiny object because that's clickbait, and we want people to click on our site. The Washington Post, thank you, Jeff Bezos, now has fewer than 100,000 subscribers. They're at their lowest level.
Really?
They are at their lowest level in
Good.
more than 50 years.
Wow.
And but so how do you're going to tell me that Trump wears a stuffed bird on his head and we're not going to report
Yeah.
that on page one?
Yeah.
Right.
Well, now I'm going to annoy you, Joan. So you also know when I've frequently called for what I've only heard Governor Pritzker utter that one time in New Hampshire for wide-scale, sustained mass protest. As I put it, starting on a Monday, not for a couple hours on a random Saturday. How does this situation with the distraction and the overwhelming the media and the lack of context reporting, do you think that interferes with the ability of opposition or resistance to organize?
I think we are in a situation where we are beginning as a people to understand that nobody is going to step forward and lead the charge. Nobody's going to save us. We just got 3 ridiculous rulings from the Supreme Court.
Right.
The Supreme Court is capitulating to Trump. The Republican Senate and Congress are capitulating to Trump. There is no branch of government right now that is trying to hold the line. And I think people are starting to realize it is up to us. Like, unlike European countries, I mean, France, they get ticked off about something and,
the people pour into the streets.
Yes, everybody's in the street.
Everything shuts down.
Nobody's working at any job. But
Yeah.
we don't have that same kind of take to the streets. First of all, we're so big and we're so spread out that kind of action is more difficult to organize. But I think it's coming because there is nobody but us to save this democracy right now. Mike Johnson isn't going to save it. John Thune might want to, but he's not going to, because God forbid any of his Republican senators up in the midterm, lose their positions. And as we've just seen from this morning, 6-3, 6-3, 6-3 decisions
insane.
from the Supreme Court. The
Yeah.
conservative members of the Supreme Court are not going to save us. We got nobody but ourselves. So
I agree with the conclusion, but where's your optimism coming from? Where do you see the recognition? Where do you see movement towards that kind of?
because every time there's been a call for a nationwide protest, they're getting bigger and they're getting bigger and they're getting bigger. And they're not just taking place in blue cities and blue states. They're taking place in red states. They're taking place in small communities. And, you know, I talked about Donald Trump's superpower. His Achilles heel is that he doesn't know how to take care of his voters. When
Right.
that tiny
He
little
doesn't care about them.
all red community where was in Missouri, when
Yeah.
the woman who was their favorite waitress at the Pancake House got
Oh,
taken
yeah.
by ICE. I mean, those are
After
Trump
30 years.
people. Those are Trump people, and they're all starting to wear T-shirts, "Bring Carol home," and you know he's doesn't. You know he's cutting grants not just to Harvard but to the University of Alabama, which is the single largest employer in the state. He is indiscriminately hurting everyone. How long are people going to stay loyal to him? You know, the woman in the Washington Post. Well, I voted for him because he said he was going to make in vitro fertilization free, and then he didn't. And she worked for the Park Service. Now she doesn't even have a job. So you know, not only did she not get free IVF, she and her husband can't even afford IVF. How long? How many of his own supporters is he gonna treat like crud? And I think that's why these protests are getting bigger, and they're starting to be in red states and little red communities. And I still think we're going to have a hard time doing like the general strike. I mean, that's just something that's never been a part of our protest history. But I think the protests are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more of the people who voted for Trump are going to be joining them, because it's like, I wanted him to do X, but I didn't think he would come after me or my family or my colleagues or the people I care about. It was supposed to be those other people who got hurt. And all of a sudden they're waking up. Or as who was it? One pundit said, it may have been Stephen Colbert on the Late Show, said people are going to have to remember how much they didn't like him last time. They forgot that. They forgot how much they didn't like him. They're starting to remember.
Although I will correct you on one thing, Joan, we used to have a history of general strikes,
That's where I was
and
gonna go.
then Taft-Hartley was passed in 47, making it illegal to general strike, because the people in power realized that if we kept doing general strikes the way we had before and just after World War II, that they'd be in trouble. So
but those general strikes made a huge difference, right? Like it brought antitrust laws, it brought bargaining rights and labor rights. And more recently, there was the Occupy movement. While that wasn't maybe mass, it was widespread and it was sustained, right? It wasn't just a couple hours on a Saturday. Those were people who were, and I was wondering, like, do you see any sign of rebranding that to make it a more general?
All right, let me restate that, though, in a different way as I'm hearing the two of you talking about this. The other thing I see pressing back is the demonization of protest. And this has been around for a long time, and it is absolutely something that the power structure is doing now and that the media has been eating up. The idea that if there's a protest, it must be a violent protest. And they hardly ever cover the fact that 99% of these are nonviolent. You know, the fact that they show the burning trash can any place or the one burning car in the entire city of protests. How do we push back against that? Are we going to be able to push back against that? What's it going to take to get the protest side to be above the internal structure that says we're reporting that protests are bad?
Well, ideally, you know, I mean, in some areas they offer training for protests, you know, what to do in this situation, what to do in that situation. And if you look at the No Kings, I mean, what, 99.9% was absolutely peaceful. That is a problem, because, you know, if it bleeds, it leads. If we've got a burning car, that's great video. Let's show the burning car. Oh, yeah, we might also mention that for 15 blocks around, people were protesting peacefully. But that burning car, man, that's really some good stuff. We do have to worry about that. And I think that that's everybody was afraid in Los Angeles, and the word went out, protest, but protest peacefully, because we don't want to give Trump any opportunity to
Pretext.
come in
Right.
and say, you guys are out of control, here's martial law, that kind of thing. And, there's very much a mob mentality. And sometimes people who are otherwise level-headed can get carried away by the emotion of a crowd. I think that's particularly true for teenagers, the younger set, who perhaps have a hard time understanding the implications of what they're doing. It feels good in the moment. That's what they know. What is it? Up until 25, all your impulse control isn't fully developed. So I think that is a concern, and people who are the organizers of these protests, I think, have to work very hard against this. The other part of that is, we are so used to the administration trying to demonize that I think maybe we're starting to be like a little bit inoculated against it. Look, for example,
The
the
radical
victory,
lunatic line.
the victory of Zoran Mamdani in New York. This guy hasn't won the general election. He hasn't started as New York City mayor, and he's already being demonized as a terrorist.
Oh, yeah. They want to throw him out of the country.
And Jewish people, you ought to be really afraid, because he's a Muslim. Even though Brian Lander, the controller who
Big
ran,
cross endorsed.
is coming out so strongly, saying, this is a good guy. This is one of the best people I know.
Yeah.
Let's wait and see. Maybe he'll be a great mayor. He's got great ideas. Maybe he'll figure out how to pay for them in a way that doesn't cause immense pain to the people of New York. But let's let him try. Maybe he'll fall flat on his face. We can scold him then. We can criticize him then. But to criticize him, it's like, I generally really enjoy reading Charlie Sykes, the former Wisconsin conservative radio host. But Charlie Sykes was absolutely clutching his pearls over this election. He's a Democratic Socialist. Oh my God. Oh my God, the world is going to come to an end. And
so let's elect a rapist instead.
But what he said was, the guy himself wants to do this, but let's look, he calls himself a Democratic Socialist. Let's look at what they want. I do a show called Live, Local, and Progressive. And if somebody wanted to go after me, they could say, oh my God, let's look at all these crazy things that progressives want. Joan Esposito, she's terrible. When I perhaps don't subscribe to any of those ideas. Being a little, I'm generally too moderate for progressives, and I'm still too progressive for conservatives. So, I think we get into real trouble when we label people and assume that everything that goes with that label is who they are and what they want. Give the guy a shot. Maybe he'll be great. Volodymyr Zelensky was an entertainer and a comedian, for God's sake. He seems to be doing okay. Give the guy a chance to do what he wants to do. And if he can't do it, if he wants to raise taxes sky high, if he alienates people, then he will be voted out. Could he be worse than Eric Adams? Eric Adams, who was the closest thing to a Republican the Democrats could find, and only by the grace of Trump is not in jail right now.
I think it's ironically funny that Joel and I were just fighting about labeling on Facebook this morning. So you played right into that. One quick thing on Mamdani, and then I have a follow-up to what you're saying. I follow this very closely. My youngest is in New York and was active in the campaign. And it's fascinating to me, the quote-unquote anti-Semitic elements, and I see it popping up on social media. There were so many Jews from Mamdani that were in there. It was approximately half of his support was coming from Jewish communities. It was just insane how much it was there. And he's very much not anti-Semitic, but he's still getting labeled that way and shown that
But he's a Muslim, so be afraid. Be very afraid.
Exactly. Now I'm going to take us out on the edge. And I'm going to take us so far out on the edge that I have to preface this by saying I personally am in no way, shape, or form in favor of violence, and I do not believe that violence is the solution. Having said
Even though
that,
you have that split apart project?
thank you. The Come Together project. See us on the web. Anyway, let's go to France, though, because you brought up France, Joan.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite jokes that's floating around right now is there's an American girl who has a French boyfriend, and he looks at the newspaper every morning, and his response to her is, how can you people deal with this? Why aren't you
Yeah.
lighting your cities on fire?
Yeah.
And that's the French response. And this is
Mhm.
one of the most interesting things to me is we're sitting here from the perspective of, I think all of us are in favor of protesting, and yet we can't see the lighting on fire side. Joan, you just told us that if we light things on fire, we get into the news. The French have shown us that if they light things on fire, they get laws changed.
Yeah.
But our
Yeah.
culture doesn't allow that kind of violence and has demonized that kind of violence. Is that just the reactionary successfully demonizing it? Is it right that we should be less violent, or are there times when you got to do things to get into the news?
Can I say yes?
So where does race fit into all of that?
Yeah, all of the above. I would say there's a very there's an extreme cultural difference, and a historical tradition of political resistance that's very different in France than it is here. We have a way we're used to doing things. It's the Martin Luther King Jr., the John Lewis. We're going to be peaceful. We're going to protest. You might beat the crap out of us, but we're not going to go away. Those are the movements that have been wildly successful in the United States. So rather than rolling cars and setting them on fire, I'd say sit down in the middle of the street. Sit down in the middle of the street, sing a song, let the police have to drag you off.
So I love being on video because I can raise my hand when I want to interject as opposed to just on radio. I don't think we have a history of peaceful protest. I think we have a history of violent protest that has been repressed by the reactionary elements that don't want us to think about it. The Haymarket riots.
Correct.
All of the things in the late 1800s and early 1900s that brought us
anarchist
all of our
movement.
rights, that put almost everything together. And yes, the civil rights movement was absolutely peaceful in the 60s, but go back 50 years before that, 100 years before that, we were violent because the people who had the power had so much control over our society that the working class didn't think they had any choice. So, Joan, I think almost everybody in America would agree with you that we have this history of nonviolence, but that doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah.
There are different sides to the story.
What I was trying to say was I think those kinds of protests are really, really, really effective, because when the video was broadcast on the news of all these peaceful marchers in Selma getting the crap beat out of them by police, that woke a nation up. And if it had been a riot and there had been violence on both sides, it would have been too easy for white people to dismiss it.
That's exactly right. And
Joel, how come I'm being the radical today?
the relationship between state and society, oddly, is different now than it was then. We have an explicitly violent, fascist, I would argue, regime, violent against the American people. And so a violent protest just adds to their pretext and their disinformation about radical, violent, lunatic left. And so the counter to gain the advantage information would be for everyone to go and just sit down in the streets, Gandhi-like.
And the only thing
but we actually don't have a tradition of that nationally. We have a pockets of it, right? There was the suffrage movement, there was the civil rights movement, there was maybe the anti-war movement, but that anti-war movement was successful, I have always argued, because of the success of the civil rights movement. It was kind of a piggyback on that. Like, I don't know how it would have gone had the civil rights movement not been there. So I think it's a little bit of an open question, like what would work now? because you can say, right, lighting the cars on fire, that captures the media attention. Look, there's something burning,
Right.
but I think it would be even more shocking if on a Monday there was a general strike in this country, because we really,
Mhm.
for at
Oh
least
yeah.
110 years, don't that hasn't happened here.
No,
So
100%. No question about that at
no.
You
all.
know, this is on the lighter side and kind of a little bit tangential, but people power can really work.
Yeah,
Case in point, Jeff Bezos' big wedding in Venice,
yeah,
they had to move their venue to an
yeah,
island where they could
Yeah.
raise the bridges because they ran into so much protest, and
yeah.
Greenpeace was there.
Yeah.
And I think that was amazing. And he tried to, buy them off. Oh, I'm donating $1 million to this group and $1 million
Yeah,
to, which is of course pocket change for him, but
Right.
that's
yeah.
another story.
Yeah.
But the protests clearly, they did not expect that there would be the protest that there was. And, like I said, they had to find a place that was a lot more secure, literally at the last second. So, I mean, there is power in large, peaceful protest.
There
Uh,
can be.
should I ask the stupid question?
You can ask the stupid question.
Uh, this time it's stupid, maybe because it's not answerable, but I get to make you answer it this time, Joan. Uh, if you could wave your magic wand and um, to spur that kind of general strike, peaceful general strike, occupy the streets, uh, what message would you say would what message or what messenger uh, is needed to do that? And if you what would you, when you wave the wand, what messenger and what message would you have delivered?
I read recently somebody used the phrase hopeful warriors, and I really like that. I want to be a hopeful warrior, and I want other people to be hopeful warriors. I don't think I wouldn't worry so much about sending a message to Trump, but I think that we already know from Mitch McConnell that there are a lot of Republicans currently in Congress and in the Senate who believe that this will be their last term because they know they are doing things that are going to be wildly unpopular in their states. That's, I think, right now the weak spot. That kind of pressure that the Senate is under right now. I think that's why we see this budget bill start to lose some of its more radical elements, or at least they're being refocused. And if those people, because my experience is that they believe they are simply the best person to be in that job. And if I have to sacrifice my beliefs or my morals to get reelected, so be it. Because I'm the best person to be here. I really
Mhm.
truly am. But if they believe their constituents are going to vote them out of office, then maybe the threat of Trump not endorsing them or running a primary candidate against them is the lesser of two threats. That's where I think the weak spot is right now. And Donald Trump, like I said, he doesn't have any positions, he doesn't have any beliefs. He wants to be rich and he wants to be powerful, and he wants everybody to acknowledge that he's rich and powerful. So if he sees the sands starting to shift, you think he's not going to try to take advantage of that? Just like with Iran. Israel went in and did all the heavy lifting, and then he wants to send a couple of bombers and be like, I brought peace to the Middle East. Oh, look at me. Nobel Committee, are you watching?
Yeah.
He's not a man who has that was the joke in his first term. Whatever position he had was based on the last person who talked to him about the
Oh yeah.
issue.
That wasn't a joke.
No, it wasn't a joke, and it's frankly true in this administration as well. So if he sees the sands starting to shift, if he sees Republicans starting to waver in their support for him, he's going to do whatever it takes to again make himself appear as the leader, the powerful guy. And like when for the tariffs, some of his really rich donors were from the agriculture and hospitality businesses. And for 24 hours, ICE went
Yeah.
too far. They're not going to go after agricultural or hospitality workers. And then literally 24 hours later, oh, yeah, well, they are. Never mind. They are.
Mhm.
He'll do
Didn't
whatever
even
it
take
takes.
the normal 2 weeks that he offers everybody.
Yeah.
I know. Where was our 2 weeks?
Yeah.
One thing, Joan, you just made me think about something which is always dangerous when it comes
Yeah.
through. Maybe we need to do a little bit of wag the dog and push the story out there and see this might be a very profitable way to do it. Push the story that Republicans are losing in Republican districts. Push the story that what they're doing is bad for their people, and see if that's something that gets more into the mainstream.
I think that's a really good idea. I absolutely do, because I think getting the word out to the public helps sway public opinion. Within Capitol Hill, they know it. I mean, Tommy Tuberville, who is, I used to say he was the stupidest man in the Senate, but I think there's one other that I deemed even stupider. But so he's right up there. He came out when this bill was first presented to them. Well,
Yeah.
a lot of people in my state are on Medicaid. Oh, this is going to be really unpopular. Now all of a sudden
Oh, yeah.
he's leaving the Senate to run for governor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing how that works. Well, Joan Esposito, it's wonderful to turn the tables on you.
Yeah.
Although, really, we just had a discussion like we do on the radio all the time anyway.
All the time. Yep.
So it's not too much different. Thank you very much for joining us. It's great to put some of this stuff into perspective and see the discord in the United States from the media side, and kind of look at it, since it's incredibly important. That's where we all literally get our news. So we need to be thinking about these things more. Joel, anything to add?
No, I just subtract at this point.
Okay, fantastic. Joan, thank
More
you.
divide.
And
Thank
I'd like
you
to
both.
thank all of our listeners for tuning in with us. Thank you, David, for producing. And we will see you all soon. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.